I regret very much what has happened about the flag. The flag that people look at now is the flag that was carried during the demonstrations against civil rights. It was carried by Ku Klux Klansmen, all that kind of thing, and that's what it represents to a great many people, and I don't wonder that they're feeling pain and wanting to take it down. I understand perfectly well they do that, but to my mind, they're misidentifying that flag. That flag represents many good things, and you have to translate yourself back into the time of secession to understand how some states should want to secede. The Constitution has not been amended in 61 years. This was the First Amendment, the Emancipation Amendment was the First Amendment in 61 years of the Constitution, and absolutely the first amendment that ever had anything to do with anybody's private property. So they saw this amendment coming. They said, we don't want any part of this union. We want to get out of it. And people who say slavery had nothing to do with the war just as wrong as people who say slavery had everything to do with the war. That was a very complicated civic thing. Robert Toombs or somebody once gave the best definition of that war I've ever heard. He said it was a war of one form of society against another form of society. And because one of those forms of society included chattel slavery, and the other side didn't, except to a limited extent, it's always been identified as a war over slavery. Believe me, no soldier on either side gave a damn about the slaves. They were fighting for other reasons entirely in their minds. Southerners thought they were fighting the Second American Revolution. Northerners thought they were fighting to hold the Union together. And that held true throughout the whole war, except for some people who were absolute partisans on both sides, fire eaters in South Carolina and abolitionists in Massachusetts. But most of the people were fighting because they were fighting for, Southerners once said, I'm fighting because you're down here. If you want to invade my home, you got me to fight. Others say you're trying to tear the fabric of the Union, therefore you should be put down and not allowed to do what you claim you want to do. It's a very complex subject, and I'm sorry to see it degenerate into such things as identifying that flag as a symbol of racism. It is not. It was never intended as such. Confederacy respected law above all things.
I am a contrarian on Abraham Lincoln, and I bemoan the fact that he's been mythologized since the progressive era, since the era of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and particularly by the public school establishment in the United States, which almost would have you believe he's the fourth member of the Blessed Trinity. I prefer to look at Lincoln this way. At the time that he was the president of the United States, slavery was dying a natural death all over the Western world. It had just been expired by legislation in England. It has just died a natural death. That is, it was no longer economically feasible in Puerto Rico and Brazil. And the southern plantation owners were on the cusp of it dying here. Instead of allowing it to die or helping it to die or even purchasing the slaves and then freeing them, which would have cost a lot less money than the Civil War cost, Lincoln set about on the most murderous war in American history, in which over 750,000 soldiers and civilians, all Americans, died. Now, that's more people killed as a result of American military action in one war than in all wars combined. That, of course, spawned Jim Crow. That, of course, spawned the Ku Klux Klan. That, of course, spawned the need for a Martin Luther King, which was a good end result from this. But the so-called freedom that Lincoln thought he was bringing wouldn't come about for another 125 years because of its birth in violence, rather than in its birth in government violence, rather than its birth in the natural progress of human freedom. He had a Republican congressman from Ohio who was critical of him deported. Abraham Lincoln locked up over 3,000 people in the North who didn't take up arms against the government, but who spoke out against it and who wrote against it and who published their writings. He had utter and total and complete disregard for the Constitution.
Habeas corpus.
Yeah, and even as a result of that, his successors have used his behavior as examples of what presidents can do in wartime. Another reason they like war, because they can disregard those nasty things called civil liberty. Look, Lincoln's soldiers burnt courthouses, robbed banks, raped women, destroyed crops, killed civilians.
I mean, certainly
and
not
they
all
were
of them.
lauded. No, not all of them. I'm talking about Sherman's March.
And this is part and parcel of what you
lauded for it as heroic. And they did this to their fellow Americans. This is hardly something out of with a myth of godlike stature you would expect to come. And yet it did, because of the demonizing of the South. Look, it's not even altogether clear if slavery was the reason for secession.
Sure.
But largely, the impetus for secession was tariffs
that
were being collected at southern ports and spent by northern politicians.